Hi everyone, my name is John. Back to review one more book that I read last year with a friend of mine on Discord. His name is Brendan, and we decided to pick this up in, I guess it was September, since I finished it on September 30th. We read Bernard Bailyn, his Ideological Origins of the American Revolution. And I just wanted to talk about it a little bit. It's one of the better known sort of classics of the 20th century. I think it was published in the late 1960s, 1967. So it is nearly 60 years old, and it's really done a lot to shape how we think about the American Revolution. At the middle of the 20th century, around when Bernard Bailyn wrote this book, the historiographical consensus position around the revolution, was pretty firmly cemented by historians who had been working even earlier in the century, called the progressive historians, people like Arthur Schlesinger and Charles Beard, who said that the driving factors of the revolution were associated with class and socioeconomic conflict. The role of ideas, or ideology, to use Bernard Bailyn's word, rarely received much attention. To the extent that ideas were important, the ones that got the most traction in standard histories argued that the revolution was the exclusive product of Enlightenment ideas like natural rights. But Bailyn's book, which won him a Pulitzer Prize and a Bancroft Prize, pushes back against both of those assumptions. In 1763, most colonists would have been comfortable identifying themselves as subjects of King George III. But just a dozen years later, the first shots at Lexington and Concord were evidence of a sea change in the way that colonists thought about English rule. Of course, the Stamp Act and the Townshend Act and the Tea Act and the Coercive Acts were all important parts in this shift, but knowing that doesn't really provide an understanding as to why these pieces of legislation were so hated by colonists. This is where ideology, or we can basically say the ways in which ideas coalesce to provide a framework for meaningful behavior, comes in. In his book, Bailyn turns his eye to pamphlets, by far the most popular method of spreading news in the colonies in the late 18th century, that were being circulated in this period to look for driving patterns, concerns, and motives that appeared to push the logic of revolution forward. At the time Bailyn was writing, these pamphlets were usually dismissed by historians as unimportant rabble, sort of mere propaganda, and therefore unworthy of serious study by historians. Bailyn takes a different approach by really looking at them and the ideas that they contain. And one of his big takeaways is that the republicanism of the radical English Whigs and their deep suspicion of entrenched power structures were most important in swaying the colonists towards their break with England. Analysis of the English Whigs wasn't new when Bailyn wrote the book. Historians like Carolyn Robbins, who wrote a book called The English Commonwealthmen, Studies in the Transmission, Development, and Circumstance of English Liberal Thought from the Restoration of Charles II until the War of the 13 Colonies, put out by Liberty Fund, by the way, published in 1959, had already sort of dealt with the influence of English Whigs, radical Whig philosophy, during the American Revolution. But in excavating the ideas going back to the earliest Republicans, people like Algernon Sidney and James Harrington and later Joseph Addison, Bailyn's book is one of the first efforts by a major historian that I know of to discuss Whiggish republicanism within the broader context of the American Revolution. Republican ideas exploded in the last third of the 17th century between the Restoration and the Glorious Revolution of 1688. Republican theorists declared that liberty was corrupted by power and that it was the civic duty of citizens to mitigate this corruption. The predominant Republican sentiment that became so popular in the colonies drove a feeling of mutual distrust, leading colonists to think that the English crown and parliament were conspiring to dismantle colonial liberties. At the same time, this fear and distrust drove what Bailyn calls a contagion of liberty, which pushed the bounds of freedom in new ways, including an increased voting franchise, the abolition of slavery, and the separation of church and state. Bailyn's thesis fails to address some important points. For example, surely ideas weren't the only impetus in the revolution. To what degree were the causes proposed by consensus progressive historians, the ones who raised questions about socioeconomic and class-based causes, to blame? He doesn't really consider that. He's more concerned with putting forward his thesis. Bailyn also doesn't account for the huge diversity in colonial opinion, with a significant portion of colonists, even up into the Revolution, remaining on the Loyalist side, even throughout the war. Whatever the merits for his argument or how it's sort of withstood the gauntlets of the cultural turn, Bailyn gives ideas their due place in a debate where they had been sort of sidelined before. And for that alone, I think the book is interesting to read, if not only by people who are studying graduate level or upper undergraduate level American history, that's not me, but by anyone who wants a more fully fleshed out understanding of what contemporary historians think of the root causes of the American Revolution. A really interesting book, like I said, a classic of contemporary American historiography about the American Revolution. Bernard Bailyn, I need to go close the window so we don't have glare. Bernard Bailyn's The Ideological Origins of the American Revolution. And I will talk to everyone very soon with another review. Bye.